All right, welcome back to Waste Some Time with Jason Green. I am Jason Green, bringing you brand new interviews right here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, sign up for Patreon. You can ask questions of my guests, like my guest today. Uh, Everyone my age or a little bit older, maybe a little bit younger, remembers August 1st, 1981, the day that MTV was born. I got to tell you, when we did the 80s cruise, working with Stephen Pearcy, we were so excited to see that Mark Goodman would be doing Stephen's interview on the boat. And I say a lot on this channel that when you watch an interview, there's so many people now. Everyone has a podcast, everyone has a video stream, that if you don't really relate to the host or like the host, or accept that the host can stay out of the way, they can be tough to watch. There's some bad ones out there. There's some great ones too. But with someone like Mark Goodman, that a lot of people grew up on, especially on that '80s cruise. If you're a fan of '80s music, you probably grew up watching MTV. You feel you can trust somebody. You bond with the interviewer. That you're along for the journey. And so, as I said, we were so excited to see Mark on the cruise, and he was nice enough to join us here today. We'll talk a little bit about his career, what he's up to now, right after this. Just wanna waste some time with you. Sometimes it seems too good to be true. Nobody I'd rather waste time with than you. All right, please welcome Mark Goodman.
Totally digging that intro, man.
Well,
Who's
thank you.
playing? That's good.
Well, it would be my band, the Sin City Rejects, and Richie Ramone on drums. So
I kind of love that.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
And you're lucky you get to play music because you can allow it. It's your music. On my podcast, right. We don't get to play music.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's the only music that I can play. So, Mark, I thank you for indulging me, because some of these questions you've answered so many times, and then a lot of it is in this book that I have right here, VJ: The Unplugged Adventures of MTV's First Wave. It's still available. You can still get this. It's in print.
Of course. And it's in paperback too. That's lovely.
Yes,
you
I
have
saw
the hardbound, but paperback.
Well, I have the hardbound, but I also have a signed. I have a signed.
Oh, that is cool, man! You got the VJs to sign it?
I think it came that way, but I do. I do have it. But yes, the paperback's available. We'll put a link in the description if people want to check that out. So, Mark, I know a lot about your career post MTV, but not as much before. Especially, now people say, I want to go into broadcasting. I want to be a podcaster. Well, some of these things didn't exist. At what age did you decide that radio and broadcasting was a career for you?
Pretty early. I realized, I'm old enough to have seen the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, 1963. I was a kid. I was single digits, but that was like, okay, I want to do that. And for some reason, I was drawn to Ringo. So I was trying to play the drums, and I pretty much sucked at the drums. So, and I was one of those kids who was like, I don't want to learn to play the drums. I want to play the drums, if you know what I'm saying. So I realized early on, okay, so I don't have the drive to learn how to play an instrument. What else can I do that would keep me involved in music? And at that time, in the late 60s, underground radio was just beginning. FM, nobody gave a damn about FM. If you remember, it was AM stations. That's where the music was. That's where the hits were. And FM was like an afterthought to companies as well as listeners. It was stereo, so it was higher quality. And there was one classical music station in Philly where I'm from, WMMR, which I wound up working on and being a music director for later. 10 to 2 at night, they did a show called the Marconi Experiment. The rest of the day was classical music. 10 to 2 at night, the Marconi Experiment. And I would listen to that. I was in high school. And this guy, Dave Herman, who was the DJ, what he did made me say, I want that. I want to do that. I want to be in radio so I can tell people about the music that I love. I want to talk to artists that I think I relate to. And that was where, from like 12 or 13 years old, that was kind of the drive. I wound up ultimately going to college, being a communications major, and at Temple University in Philly, where I'm from, I did a double internship in my senior year, and I worked at an AM station in Philadelphia where they were just beginning what later became known as audience research, phone out research. And they bought an FM station at the time, and they hired me to work weekend overnights. That was my first gig in radio. And within a year or so, I was working full time. I worked at WSAN in Allentown, an AM radio station that was freeform progressive. I did afternoon drive there. This was 1976, and ultimately got a job at WMMR and in '77, and worked there. I was the music director ultimately by the time that I left in 1980, and went to PLJ in New York. I was, offered a job at PLJ in New York, the #1 rock station in the #1 market in the country, which is, for radio guys, that's what else? That's it. That's where you want to be. So I
Yeah,
thought it was
that's what
all
I
over.
was. That's the
Huh?
big leagues. I mean,
It
you,
is
you get called up to radio in New York, especially at that
right,
time.
right. So
And
so this is
PLJ,
1980. July of 1980. I moved to New York, and PLJ was the #1 station in the #1 market in the country. And within, I don't know, 7, 8 months, I was dying. I was bored to tears. I love, Meatloaf and Foreigner and all that stuff. It's great, love it. But I want to play other stuff too. There was so much happening in music that wasn't getting played, and I was just like, "What the hell am I gonna do?" And I got a call from a friend of mine in radio back in Philadelphia who told me about someone we both knew who was working at this new company, Warner Amex, and they were doing some sort of, I don't know, 24-hour a day video music thing. So maybe you wanna check them out. I did.
before before we get into that, I just want to mention at your PLJ days, you say you started in, I think, June of '80. In
July,
December of
yeah,
July, in
yeah.
December of 1980, John Lennon is shot and killed in New York City. Anyone who lived in New York remembers that night. I remember my parents' reaction more than anything. And John Lennon, a hero to so many people, and you're on the radio 10 to 2. What is it like to get that information?
It's, unimaginable, really. It was the second time ever that I cried on the air. Um, but the way that it went down, yes, I was on the air, and at about 11 PM, somewhere in that neighborhood, we started to get calls from listeners who were saying, "Howard Cosell on Monday Night Football just announced that John Lennon was shot." And I hadn't heard anything about it. The listeners were the people who told me first. PLJ was an ABC affiliate, so I went around the corner to the AM side, which was the news department. And when I walked into the room, they hadn't heard anything either.
Wow.
And as I was standing there, it came across the wire that John Lennon was shot. He wasn't dead yet. He was shot. And so I went back on the air and announced that. And within minutes, it came across that he was dead. And I promptly started crying and started to play Beatles music. We just got into Beatles music. As it happens, not only was I on the air when it happened, but I was living literally right next door to the Dakota.
Wow.
I had to come home that night at 2 a.m. when I got off the air, and there was a huge crowd in front of the Dakota, of course, singing and flowers, and I wasn't even allowed on the street until I showed ID to prove that I lived there. But that was, and I was gratified that they were all listening to PLJ, which meant that all those people were listening to me when they came. That the word got out, people just went to the Dakota. A crazy, horribly sad night, as the week following was. There was the moment of silence, 10 minutes, in fact, of silence. A few days later, at what is now Strawberry Fields, just right across the street.
Yeah.
One of the most awful nights of my career, for sure.
It's people turn to their radio, especially at that point.
Yeah.
You're looking to hear more information, and radio is one of the first places you go. One of the reasons that I say that, I was saying earlier about, you sort of trust a broadcaster that you've grown up watching. You want to see them interview somebody. Well, you were with people during some tough times that night, especially. I bet you that anyone who listened that night remembers hearing you talk to them and sort of comfort people through this really difficult time. He was a New York legend, in addition to a music legend and a rock
Yeah.
legend.
Yeah.
And
I was amazed and lucky that I moved into that neighborhood, and sadly, I mean, I was only there in the neighborhood a relatively short time, just months. Never saw him walking around the neighborhood, and so many people I know
yeah,
have. And I never saw him walking around the neighborhood. I know I went to the drugstore where he goes. They had a big picture of him in the window, still do.
mhm,
Went to restaurants that he went to, but I never saw him. But yeah, that night, fielding a lot of phone calls, putting people on, talking about what John meant to them, what his music and what Beatles music meant, and you just wing it. What do you do in a situation like that? There was no training for that.
yeah, nothing prepares you for that.
Yeah, yeah.
I have to ask you. You say that was the second moment you cried on there. What
Mm.
was the first?
The first moment was, I did, an interview. I was still am a huge Little Feat fan, and, after Lowell George had left Little Feat and was doing a solo tour, I interviewed Lowell in Philadelphia at this crappy club. It's actually, like, 40 minutes outside of Philadelphia in the wilds of New Jersey, and I interviewed him after. We talked for an hour. It's all on tape. And the next day, he went to DC and played a show in DC and died that night.
Wow.
Probably after doing what we were doing all night long, which
Sure.
is on the
Yeah,
tape.
sure.
And yeah, we got the word, the next day that he had passed in his sleep. He was very overweight, and he sort of, not that you could guess that he was going to pass, but you could see he wasn't the healthiest of guys, and there's a fair amount of drugs involved. And I got that word literally. I was maybe 45 minutes away from going on the air. I was already at the station, and the guy was on the air before me, and the news came across, and he knew that I had spoken to him, my friend who was on the air, and I wasn't even prepared. He invited me on to talk about my conversation with Lowell George the 2 nights before, and I was like, okay, and I started to try to explain what was happening, and I started crying.
Yeah.
Really,
Another thing, no one can prepare you for probably his last interview ever. Um,
it was, as far as I know.
yeah, it's a short window, to have
Yeah.
done another. And so, again, these are human reactions, and I think people connect to that. Something that's probably lost these days with certain programming. But in that
Mm.
time, radio people had a personality. I grew up listening to Howard Stern in New York
Yep.
City, and
Mhm.
Howard Stern really gave a view of radio. He talked about it constantly. I mean, when you said Dave Herman, I know of Dave Herman because of Howard Stern and all the other DJs that were in the building, and
Yeah.
people that were sort of radio history that maybe some people in this day and age, younger people, wouldn't remember. You talk about after PLJ, you hear about this thing with Warner that would become MTV. I heard they told you guys don't quit your jobs and maybe don't move into New York or don't buy a place. Is that true?
They didn't specifically say that, but and as was saying to you, I was at PLJ. I had a great gig. I had a 3-year contract that I was, 6 months into,
Mhm.
and so I not only could I had to get myself out of this contract. Alan Hunter, of the 5 of us, Alan was probably the least connected specifically to rock and roll music and pop music. He moved to New York from Birmingham, Alabama, to be an actor, and he at the time was nice.
Getting
He at
money
the
too.
time he was bartending, and he got hired at a sheer stroke of luck, because he knew, tangentially Bob Pittman, who was running MTV. And, you know, he got hired just because, and he kept the bartending job for the first 3 months of MTV because we didn't know. Who knew what was going to happen? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
talk about uncharted territories. But it says something about your character. Thy known self be true. You leave a great gig for a gig that you couldn't even tell anybody what it was that you were going to do.
And you have to remember in 1980, even though we were in New York, okay, the number one market in the country. And in 1980, we cable was just beginning. And in fact, when we launched August 1st, 1981, MTV was not on in Manhattan. Manhattan
Mhm,
cable did not pick it up. So nobody in Manhattan knew what was going on. It caught on very quickly. We were on in New Jersey. And
mhm.
so we would go to concerts in New Jersey and we would be mobbed. In New York, nobody knew who we were for the first year anyway.
Which is so which is so amazing because and I remember growing up in Inwood, the very tip of Manhattan, right before the Bronx, and I remember when we were finally able to get it. There's people who are watching this
Yeah.
interview who remember these things well. There's other people who are younger who have no idea that we had a TV dial that went from 2 to 13, and then after 13, the letters started, and,
Well, what about don't forget UHF,
or even crazier, yeah, you really want to blow people's mind. UHF, you had to have rabbit ears if you were gonna get if
right?
you
It
were gonna
was
get
like,
that. But the
yeah,
idea that suddenly music videos will be brought into our home. I know now people know about it and listen, we go on these 80s cruises and we're nostalgic about it. Well, what a crazy concept that we were going to have this music in our house all the time. I remember my parents, myself watching it. We'd watch it all day until the video came back on. There was no concept of recording it.
right.
If you wanted to hear "Come On Eileen," you waited until it came back on, and it would. You or
Hmm?
you wanted Thriller, you could see that one
Well,
every
hell,
hour, you're gonna get it.
literally every hour. Yes, that's true. But in
I
fact,
want
when that was happening, that era, that was whatever that was, 83, 80, I think it was late 83, 84. I could be wrong on that. But what at that moment, there was when we were playing Thriller and the whole big long production, it was like
right.
15 minutes. I had to get down to the studio from my apartment on the Upper West Side. I had to get down to the studio. I was late. I was freaking out. I was late to get there. And I run out of my apartment and I flag down a cab and I jump in and I said, please, you take me. I have to go 33rd and 10th. I'm really late. Can you go fast? Really get there? And the cab driver turns around and looks at me. He goes, hey, Mark, don't worry. They'll play Thriller 3 more times if you're late.
It's New York, yeah.
It's New York.
And yeah, Thriller was and it's true, Thriller was there for you if you needed it. 33rd and 10th, that's where MTV began.
First
And
studio, yeah.
that first day, obviously you've talked about this a lot, but I'm fascinated by it. We all know that at midnight on August 1st, 1981, it begins. It's pre-recorded though, right?
Yep, always.
Even though
I
we
did
at
that
home,
show. I did that launch show. It was my show first, so I was the
mhm,
first VJ on MTV. And well, it was supposed to be anyway.
and there was a
Technologically,
mistake.
there was a big screw up. Yes,
Yeah, tell me about that because it's fast. Because I always thought of you as the first VJ,
I
but
am
when
the
you
first VJ, despite what Alan Hunter says.
mhm,
I am.
what
What
happened?
what happened was, I mean, yeah, the technology, what we needed for MTV, the technology was not there yet. And what would happen? I recorded that particular segment, that launch segment, on the Thursday before the launch, and um, what was supposed to happen? It was the Rocket, John Lack, who was the president of the company above Bob Pittman. He was the CEO. He was the voice that said, "Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll." First words uttered on MTV. Then video killed the radio star. Then, as it turns out, Pat Benatar That's the trivia question. What was the second video on MTV? You Better Run by Pat Benatar. That's right. And then it was supposed to be me. And I was supposed to go what we now, if you've seen me, hey, welcome. You'll never look at music the same way again. And yeah, all that stuff. And our executive producer and all this stuff. And I want to introduce you to the other VJs who you'll be getting to know here at MTV. What happened was launch, and John Lack says his thing. We play those two videos, and then suddenly it's, and I'm Alan Hunter, and I'll be it's separate carts that you had to put into the machine. So it should be my segment, then it was supposed to be JJ, but he screwed up. The guy screwed up the carts, put in the wrong cart and the wrong one, or hit the wrong one first. And we were all sitting there watching it with Bob Pittman, and it was like, all right, 12:01, we already have a screw up.
Yeah, what a way to welcome yourselves. Yeah,
it was great.
I think people, regardless, as you said, you were the first show on
Look
MTV.
at those kids. God, look at those young kids. Jeez.
Yeah, it's crazy, and these are people that will be associated with you, obviously, for the rest of your life, and people that you're obviously JJ's passed away, but
Yeah.
everyone else you still see for the most part. And I met you and Alan on the '80s cruise, and you guys have been co-hosting that for quite some time.
Yeah.
But at this time, you couldn't have imagined. And what's interesting is, in the grand scheme of MTV, your part of it, '81 to '87, it's a small part of your life, but probably, obviously, the part of your life that everyone knows you for.
Yeah. It's okay. I mean, I was there from the very beginning, and Alan and I both actually quit on the same day in April. He stayed a bit longer. I left in July, but they didn't want me to leave, so they renegotiated a contract with me where from LA, I flew back to New York every month for the first year that I was out, and did a week of shows. So I would continue to be on regularly on MTV. And then beyond that, I did hosted press conferences. I did interviews for MTV. So I was part of the channel through most of the decade. But, things were certainly
Why
evolving.
did you leave?
I'll be perfectly honest. I said it in the book. I left because things were changing there, and they hired Kurt Loder from Rolling Stone magazine. This guy knows what he's talking about. I have no beef with the guy. He's a great writer. He's a scholar. But the guy previously, he could be reviewing a record and he would find a way to slag off MTV somehow. Journalists pretty much unanimously hated us. The fans loved us. So they hired Kurt Loder, to do music news, and he was going to do the interviews and stuff. And I knew, because I was the guy I got to do the best interviews, between me and JJ, especially. I mean, I'm probably exaggerating a bit, but I knew I got to do great stuff that I loved to do, that I wanted to do. I wanted to travel places. I wanted to host things elsewhere. I wanted to not be just doing VJ segments in the studio. And I knew that when Kurt was hired, they were going to have him be doing that. And I didn't want to do that anymore. So I quit.
Yeah, it says something about, again, your character. You weren't scared to walk away from a gig, obviously a gig that you were so known for and so popular for. But you followed your heart again, and knew you at that point you had no idea that 24 hours of ridiculousness was coming.
Well, that was part of it too. I mean, it took years, but while I was still there, the programmers, the executives at MTV realized, although the design was radio on television, and how do people just turn the radio on, and they listen. It's not like, oh, what time is it? Let me turn the radio on. That's the way people listen to the radio. That's not the way people watch television. And we realized that within the first few years. We did something called Dial MTV that happened every day at 5 p.m. Eastern time. And it was a phone in, vote for your favorite video thing, a countdown thing. And once people started to know that's on at that time, that we saw the numbers go up. We started to see our ratings go up. And that idea, if we program something specific, so whether it was that or we started doing on the weekends this show from Britain called The Young Ones. It was this
Right.
wacky, Brit nuts. It was like these punk guys who were
Mhm.
lunatics. So, and that was okay. That's, I forget, Sunday night at 8 o'clock. And we saw that the numbers went up. So with that in mind, they had to change the nature of the programming. And then it's a slippery slope, remote control, insane MTV game show, changed the way that game shows happen. And of course, Big Brother.
Mhm.
And thank you. I'm sorry that we created reality television.
Yeah. Well, that
Once
is.
programmers realized, holy crap, we can do an hour of programming for like 20 grand. Done.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, for sure. Well,
Cheap.
at one point in my career, I worked for Mary Ellis Bunham and John Murray, who really
Oh, Buna Murray. Oh,
yeah,
huge. Oh my,
created the real world. But
yes.
a lot of Paris Hilton and all these, a lot of shows were created by reality TV. A lot of it comes from them and their sort of humble beginnings. At the beginning of shows like The Real World, no one knew what to do. We just followed
Right.
these people around. As later it branded. But talking about your career at MTV, a few things that interest me. One is, as we know, it's recorded, but so us at home, Mark Goodman's with us for the evening and is going to talk us through these videos. But what you're doing is you're going into the office and you're the studio and you're
Mhm.
recording these segments. Did you ever feel like I think I know the answer, but at some point, oh, good, here I am. I'm going to introduce Billie Jean again. It's some of these things you probably were reading them quite often.
Well, the thing that was like radio about MTV was that it was a what was called at the time, it was like an AOR station, a rock station back in those days was AOR, album oriented radio. And that was what the programming was. So, for me to go on and introduce these things, that a lot of stuff was being played on the radio, and like radio, if it was a bigger song, it was played more often. It's as
Right.
simple as that. There's A rotations, and then there's what we call the lunar rotations, stuff that they'd stick on in the middle of the night. Although for MTV, what is the middle of the night? Because we were a nationwide station. So, midnight is on the East Coast is 3 a.m. on the West Coast, or vice versa. 3 a.m. is midnight. And it's, programming overnight is different on MTV than it was in radio. But it's the same. DJs have been facing this from the advent of contemporary rock radio. There's rotations. Songs come up.
Mhm.
It becomes at that point, at least they were new songs, and we were getting new songs, every week. Obviously, now I'm working on an 80s station. They're not making any more 80s tunes. So,
No,
you know,
you got what you got.
so, you got to kind of roll with the rotation and the things that are popular. We know the things that are popular, and they're going to come up more often. That's just the
For
way it
sure, yeah.
is.
Couple questions. I don't want to keep you all day. Do you go home and watch MTV in your private life when you were working there?
Well, as I said, for the first year, we couldn't. I wanted to,
Right, you lived in New York.
because we really, we didn't know what to do. What does a VJ do? We had no idea. So we wanted to be able to go home and see it. And they actually, in the first year, they sent us home. They started sending us home with tape that we could watch at home, a VHS tape, so that we could at least see what MTV looked like.
Yeah.
But ultimately, um, I didn't watch it all that much at
Mhm.
home because I was listening to music, and I was trying to keep up with whatever I was going to be talking about on the show the next day. And we would get packages every night. It was delivered all over where we were all living all over the city. which had a bunch of what would be our music news to record for the following day. And I don't even remember how the hell we did it without the internet, but we would all be home like prepping news and stuff for the next day. And I don't know how we did it, but we all did it somehow.
Yeah, you must think, boy, if I did this now, well, you do Sirius Radio. It's
Yeah.
you can do it in your home. What a long way we've come.
I mean, the idea, if I would have known back then that there was going to be something like, or that there was something like that existed at that time, that would have made my job, all of our jobs, so much easier. I mean, we literally, we had to subscribe to Rolling Stone magazine, the physical. That's what we needed. Spin. We needed the magazine in our hands to keep up with stuff. Yeah, I mean, the way that it is now is way, way different. Certainly the research that I do for 80s and for Classic Rewind, it's about the same stuff and it's similar. But my job now, rather than sort of reporting on stuff that's current, and is to update whatever it is that I'm playing on either of these stations, because they're both classic stations, and make it current. What are these guys doing today? Who's on tour? Who's doing farewell tours? Who has a new album? Who's suing who? To make it current. That is my job with both of those stations, to make it feel
Which
relevant.
is great for the artist, just like these 80s cruises. People need to know where these artists are, and they tune in to hear their favorite songs, and someone they trust, they get some of that information. You met so many famous people, you interviewed so many, I mean, legends. I mean, some of the most massive people. You watched this We Are the World documentary. You've met every single one of these people at one point, or interviewed them. The infamous interview 1983 is David Bowie. You've talked about this a ton, but David Bowie decides to ask you why they don't play more black artists on MTV. This would be 1983, the same year that Thriller will now be. Thriller was ridiculousness way ahead of its time. It was going to be on all the time, but he sort of ambushes you with this question. You weren't prepared to answer it. You did your best. One, tell me how you felt, and two, my friend asked me yesterday. I said, I'm going to have Mark Goodman on. He said, I'd like to know, did he ever see David Bowie again after that interview? So
two things. No, I didn't see him after. And the other thing is, I'm done talking about this. It's in the book. I explained it. I'm done.
Yeah. And I get it. And I got that vibe from other interviews that you've said this story so many times, but people can read it and people can understand. And
it's in the book. It's in the documentary. It's in the I Want My MTV documentary, which I thought was not that great, but it's in there too.
Yeah, and it's not something that you want on your tombstone. What is the interview for you that's the most memorable?
There's a few, really, and for different reasons. I mean, the big one was Paul McCartney. I was sent to London to talk to Paul when he was recording. Sadly, he was recording "Give My Regards to Broad Street." Not, one of his best records.
I remember that.
Yeah. But the cool thing about it was that on that soundtrack and in that movie, he redid some Beatles songs. So what happened for me was they sent me to London, and he was recording the soundtrack at Air Studios. And so he's in the midst of the recording. He comes and we set up, and I was told at the time we'd have 15 minutes with Paul McCartney. 15 minutes. I mean, but that's what we had. And what wound up happening was we were chatting and talking about Broad Street and stuff. And obviously it was only a few years after John had been murdered, and we got into that a bit. And then I'm looking directly at Paul, and behind Paul is his publicist running back and forth across and giving me the cut, you're done, cut. And I just leaned into Paul and said, they want me to stop, Paul. And he leaned into me, he smiled, and he said, let's not. And I was like, all right, how do you like me now? And we spoke for an hour. It was a phenomenal interview. I couldn't believe that, little Marky, 9-year-old Marky was talking to the guy who we saw on Ed Sullivan all those years ago. And then afterwards, he invites me into the studio. So I go into the control room of the studio, and then you know studio. So there's across from the control room is glass, and then there's the booth, like the recording, like a vocal booth. So I sit down next to George Martin
Wow.
at the board to my right, and I'm looking through the glass, and there's Paul McCartney holding his Hofner violin bass,
Mhm.
and he's doing an updated version of one of the Beatles songs for that soundtrack. That's it. I'm done. Check, please.
Yeah.
He
How incredible.
topped it. He topped it though. After all of that, we were leaving, and it was my first time in London. I was there with my wife at the time, and he asked, "Is this your first time here? And you know, where you have some plans for going to for dinner?" And I said, "Well, we're working on it." He says, "Let me suggest some places you can go to somewhere." I forget where he even mentioned, but that's a little pricey, so maybe you don't want to go there. And I'm thinking, yeah, if Paul McCartney thinks it's pricey,
Yeah. Oh my
um,
God.
and then he recommended another restaurant. I think it was Stringfellows, but whatever it was, Paul McCartney got on the phone and called them and talked to the manager and made a dinner reservation for me and my wife.
I bet
Paul
you got a good
McCartney.
table. Yeah. I bet you did all right.
How does that happen? So that was certainly one of the biggest interviews, one of the best interviews that I've had. There've been, contentious ones as well.
Yes. We talk about technology, and here we are talking into inanimate objects, and we're able to tell these stories. And I ask people, I do this every day. I ask people
Mm.
questions. But when you hear a question, an answer about sitting next to George Martin watching Paul McCartney record Beatles music, it's not a story you hear every day. And what a crazy thing, because you were in it at a time. I've always wondered, did artists sort of kiss up to you or send gifts thinking that maybe it would help their play on MTV?
Well, no, for me, I didn't get any gifts. Now there was plenty of artists who had massive crushes on Martha Quinn, so
Right.
she probably got some stuff. I don't know for sure.
Did Michael Jackson really send you guys those red jackets?
Yeah, Alan Hunter still has his.
I saw it. Yeah.
That's right. You saw. That's right. He had it on the cruise. I forgot.
Mhm.
So yeah, he actually did. He sent us
Where
those.
did yours go?
Be damned if I know. There's, in fact, in that picture that you pulled up earlier, I'm wearing a jacket that I love that I wish I had now, and I have no idea. I think I left my entire wardrobe at the studio when I quit. I guess so. I lost out.
Amazing. You quit. What do you do? You're living in New York City. That's not cheap. You're
No.
now out of a job. What happens?
Well, it's the decision to leave was not easy. Part of what influenced it, I was saying, was them hiring Kurt Loder, but also what influenced my leaving was that I started a few years earlier. I started getting people calling to have me appear in movies
Right.
that were being done, and so I did. I did the first one that I did. Um, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was playing me. I was playing myself, and but I realized I didn't know what the hell I was doing, because you still have to, I had sort of lines and stuff like that, and I realized I didn't know what I was doing, so I started to study acting, and I thought, well, I don't know how great I'm going to be, but let me try it out, and I wound up. The decision that I made to leave was like, okay, I'm okay as an actor. I'm not the best ever, but maybe trading on my MTV, whatever it might be, if I get a couple of gigs a year, crappy gigs in movies or television, and they pay me, 75 grand or 100 grand, a couple of gigs a year, I can live on that. So that was the plan. Of course, it didn't work out like that, because I was worse than I even imagined as an actor.
Well,
I did get some stuff.
you're comfortable on camera, so you would think that that would help. And you're a good listener, because doing this job, you have to listen, and acting is about listening. But
Right.
it wasn't for everybody. There's a hustle to acting too. Going on these auditions and this crazy
Yeah, little
lifestyle.
did I know about. I had no idea about that stuff. But I got when I first moved to LA. So what were the roles that I was put up for? Drug dealers, rock and rollers, itinerant people, homeless, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which was fine. That's fine. I had a giant fro when I was at MTV, so I cut it to try and look a little more sort of conservative. And um, so I got some roles here and there, but just really not enough to
Yeah.
really make a living that way.
Back to radio, though, right?
Ultimately, yes. I mean, what happened was after I was out in LA, and I had worked. I was on Married with Children. I did a career arc on Parker Lewis Can't Lose. I
Sure.
don't know who remembers that show.
Yeah.
Um, and so I started to do that kind of stuff, and then um, my wife at the time got pregnant, and I was like, okay, I need a job. And I literally pulled out the radio trade magazines, and I just looked and I went, yeah, I'd like to live in San Francisco or Chicago. That's cool. I wouldn't mind living there. And I came up with like a list of like 5 stations, and I wrote to all of them, sent them tape, and I said, hey, I'm Mark Goodman from MTV. Anything happening over there? And I got a job in Chicago, doing mornings in Chicago at Q101. So yeah, back to radio, but like I want to say 92-ish, I think 92 or 93. And before that, I had been doing I'm telling you a disjointed story. I'm sorry, Jason.
That's all right.
What ultimately happened fairly soon upon my getting to LA, and JJ was out. We were all out there, all of us. Um, JJ had got a job as a program director of a radio station there, and he hired me and some other radio legends, a guy named Jim Ladd, who was well known in LA since the 60s, legendary DJ, just passed a little while ago. And I started doing that radio station ultimately, and it was sort of semi freeform and cool alt stuff, but we could stretch out. And then the station got bought and went under. And so I was looking for work again, as we always do in radio. And I wound up getting a gig at K Rock in LA, like the station to be at, leading. When I was in radio programming in 77 and 78, I was watching what K Rock was doing and seeing what they were adding. They are the flagship alt station. So I started working there, and then I wound up quitting there to go to Chicago. And, then I started getting back into radio. I worked remotely. I did mornings at a station in Phoenix, Arizona, and radio is sort of home for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And for people watching, you can tune into the 80s on 8. You can tune into Classic Rewind, both channels that Mark is on, and listen to some of your favorite music. Hear some of these great stories. We just scratched the surface. I mean, the to know that Madonna and Prince and Michael Jackson, these are all people that have come into your contact many times. The first
Yeah.
MTV Music Awards. Stephen Piercy was showing me pictures that he had of you and him
Yeah.
and Amy
Yeah.
Mann.
I know exactly the picture. I know exactly the picture he's talking about.
First first MTV Awards, which was
Yeah.
crazy for all of us. What I gotta ask you, I got 2 more questions. I'll let you get out of here. I gotta ask what happened to MTV when you look at it now and you look at how exciting it was then. Do you ever ask? I'm sure you do. Where are the music videos on music television?
Well, I don't know how exactly what number of years have passed, but if you remember, the logo was the giant M, and underneath the M, it said music television.
Uh,
They took that away, I want to say 10 years ago. It may be a little less, maybe a little more. It's not music television anymore. And so many people come up to me. Obviously, I understand that we were a part of people's lives.
right.
We were the refuge for a lot of people. And so many come up to me and they go, oh man, why don't you guys, we'd love to have you guys all back. MTV should come back and play videos. And no, it shouldn't. There's no need for MTV to play videos now. There's YouTube. That alone, just you can go on and see whatever you want, whenever you want, watch it as many times as you want. There's no need for us to be doing that. What that version of consuming music doesn't have is something that I think is important. a curator. You need I I want to be that person, and I feel even now that's I don't think the algorithm is as good a curator as a person.
Yeah, as a person who's lived it,
Yeah.
experienced it, knows the people, knows the
And has
music.
ears, can listen and yeah.
Yeah, and react and bring people through hard times. Things like John Lennon's passing. These are things that are only a human could do. I have to ask you, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Should the original five VJs be in the Hall of Fame?
Well, I think yes, and I've heard from many that they agree. There is sort of a radio friend of mine, a guy named Matt, who lives in New Jersey and was a fan of the music talk show that I did on Sirius XM for 6.5 years. It was a talk show about music, like sports talk or political talk. And he was a big fan of that show. The channel was called Volume. He has at VJs for Rock Hall. That is something that he has online, and he is gathering and has gathered petitions. He's gotten 5, 6, 7,000 signatures, which I appreciate. Matt is great at doing that, and a lot of people have suggested that. I feel kind of I'm not going to lobby for it. I feel like
Sure. Well, no,
embarrassed,
no. It's
but
the people's place to say that they want it.
and
Obviously,
but
we
it's not.
want it.
The for that we would have to go in under a different category, not a performer category, like where you know people who are contributors in the business, go in. And I think Meg Griffin, who was hired at MTV, she was Martha Quinn before Martha Quinn. She quit before we launched, and they hired Martha. But Meg is in the Rock Hall, I believe, as a broadcaster. And I think they have people like Wolfman Jack and stuff in there, I think.
Yeah, no, I believe so too. I think there's people. I'm surprised if Jim Ladd's not in, but I'm sure there's a lot of people outside the industry.
Mm,
If for someone, like I said, my age, if you grew up in the 80s, your music was brought to you by the original five DJs on MTV. For
right.
people who watch my show, rock fans, they all know that JJ was there when Kiss was unmasked. I mean, these are moments that people that
Yeah.
people love. And so, of course, I think it will happen. I think people want to see it. This nostalgia, even though we talk about it, 81 to 87, such a short amount of time, but in our minds, especially these are formative years for me. I'm in school, and so are a lot of my peers. It's important to us, and we'd like to see those VJs remembered. It's a time that's hard to explain to other people who never got to experience it.
The talk show that I was talking about on the Volume channel, which Sirius XM shut down about a year and a half ago, the show that we were doing was called Debatable, and I'm now doing that same show with my co-host Alan Light, who is an amazing journalist. He writes for the New York Times and for Vanity Fair, and he was the editor at Rolling Stone, editor at Spin. He's written Prince book, Let's Go Crazy, like one of the definitive Prince books. He was the co-author of Greg Allman's memoir. Great, an amazing journalist, really smart. He and I are doing that show together as a podcast. Sound Up with Mark Goodman and Alan Light, and all the stuff that we talk about here. So we try and do that there without the help of music.
Right. Sometimes that's nice though, and obviously now more than ever, the talk format is enjoyable. As I said, you get people through hard times, you distract people, you offer entertainment. So I think it's a great thing. We'll put all the links in the description so people can check you out, social media, these things, listen to your broadcasts. So
Excellent.
we'll have that. And I got to say, we met on the '80s cruise. I think I'm hooked. I think I'm ready to go again. I mean, what a fun a fun event.
The cruise has just gotten better and better. This cruise that you were on, this last one, we all think was the best one yet. It was so much fun, and it's weird to say, but it's like a family. There's so many people who go over and over and over again.
Mhm.
I see them. It's great to see them every year, and even to meet the new people who are going for their first MTV experience, you know, to meet me and to meet Alan Hunter and even Downtown Julie Brown, who is now co-hosting with us.
Yes.
It's a really fun thing, and it's not lost on us that we're a part of these people's lives, and it really means everything. It's incredible, and we feel so lucky. I don't know why it's happening, but people continue to be fascinated by the 80s.
Yes.
I don't know why.
When you're living in the 80s, you hear so much about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s,
Right.
but we'll never not hear the end of the 80s. The last maybe memorable, really memorable, crazy decade.
You know what? I agree with you. I feel like even it's sort of time, you know, when you're talking about timeline, it's time to be nostalgic for the 90s. But
Mhm.
there's, I don't know, there's a romance to me about the 80s that the 90s just didn't have. Something,
I
I don't
think
know,
so
whether it was
too.
grunge or I don't know what it is, because there was great music that came out in the 90s, but it's different. People feel differently about that decade.
Different
Uh,
attitude, different. Yeah, I
yeah.
agree. Different everything. When we went on the cruise, I said I'm excited to meet Mark Goodman, and when I met you, I'm trying to explain to my girlfriend, MTV, she wasn't there. And then later that night, we're in our cabin, and you could turn on the TV,
Oh,
and
yeah.
there's Mark Goodman with his afro, you know, sitting cross-legged up on the counter. And I go, "There's the guy. That's the guy who just, that's the
That
guy
is
who's from Best
weird
Western."
on the cruise that they're constantly running old MTV on there. That is bizarre. Yeah.
It's a great time. It's going to sell out, but they don't need us to promote it. But it's something fun and to see you interview these artists, interact with those artists. I enjoy your style. I'll say it briefly before we go. When you were interviewing Stephen Piercy, the idea was to do something different. You said on your show on Sirius XM that you would ask people to pick three songs that meant something to them in their lives. Not my favorite song, not a song that I
Not
like
one that
this.
I wrote.
Yes, and you wanted to ask questions about songs that meant something. Maybe when you were going through a divorce or a loss or something that was powerful. Music is powerful, and it took a minute to get Steven to sort of think of those things. But I thought
He
your
was
interview.
great, by the way. He was awesome. I loved he and I met back in the day,
Mhm.
but we never I did that interview. It was him and Robin that I
Yep,
talked to when they came in for the first time to MTV.
it's
But
crazy.
I mean, beyond that moment there, we never really saw each other, and to sit down and all these years later with him was really great. He's a really amazing guy.
He's not an easy interview,
It's not
and
an easy interview.
he gets fidgety. He doesn't like the lights in his eyes.
Yeah.
And but he respected you and he enjoyed doing it and he liked that there was a different idea, even though I had explained it to him a few thousand times. He liked to talk and you didn't do the same thing. So when's Rat getting back to you? It wasn't that same interview. And I think that's one of the things on that cruise that people enjoy seeing you interact with their favorite people. Mark, I
Mm.
could go on forever. I'm so grateful that you stopped by, though. It's important to me. I like to talk to broadcasters that influenced me, and of course, a whole generation of people who watched you on MTV. They'll check you out on Sirius Radio. We'll have links for everything, and we'll see more of you, Mark.
I really appreciate you inviting me on. It was great to meet you too. You were really helpful to me. You explained what was going on to Steven. You speak his language, so it was much appreciated. Really, really cool. And thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for watching.